Hello, students. Today we're going to be continuing the discussion of reproductive anatomy, physiology, and endocrinology with a focus on the female reproductive system, starting with the anatomy and then endocrinology of the female reproductive system, the female menstrual cycle, and the development of uh, the, the ovaries and the oocytes during the female reproductive cycle. Here is an image of a midline sagittal section showing the female reproductive anatomy. I'm going to highlight the terms that I do want you to know and leave unhighlighted the terms that are not necessary for you to know for the anatomy of the female reproductive cycle, or female reproductive system. The ovary is located in the abdominal cavity. It is where follicles and oocytes are going to be developed. And it is from there that oocytes are going to be ovulated, picked up by the fallopian tube. There's going to be a structure here that I will name in the next slide. Picked up by the fallopian tube, transported by ciliary action. Cilia that line the fallopian tube are going to move in a wave-like fashion and going to move the ovulated oocyte from the ovary to the uterus. The uterus has two main layers, a muscular myometrium, smooth muscle that is going to develop and become very strong during pregnancy, especially important for labor and delivery of a baby. Inside, lining the uterus, is the uterine endometrium, and we will be talking about that more later. The urinary bladder is located anterior here, and the urethra is, the exit from the urinary bladder is the urethra, just as it is in the male. But this is not important for the female reproductive system because unlike in the male, where the urethra is the structure that carries semen and sperm from the testes and the prostate to the outside. In this case, the urethra is not part of the reproductive system, nor is the urinary bladder. So I'm not highlighting those. So this is a midline sagittal section. This is anterior over here and posterior over here. Anterior structure is the clitoris. It shows it as this little nub here, which is really just the head of the clitoris. There are two wing-like structures of the clitoris that extend into the labia. And so the clitoris is not tiny. It is quite large, but most of it is embedded in the labia of the that surround the vagina. The clitoris is highly vascularized and highly innervated. It's quite sensitive. And so it is part of the female reproductive system because it leads to part of the female reproductive response. The clitoris has a prepuce. You might remember that in the male, the prepuce is the foreskin. In the female, the prepuce is the hood of the clitoris. Surrounding the clitoris and the vaginal opening are the labia. So one labium, two labia. One labium minus, the labia minora, are the labia that are sort of lip structures that surround the clitoris and the vagina. And the labia majora are the larger structures surrounding the labia minora. Both of those surround the vagina, which is the opening between the uterus and the external surface. It is where the erect penis would be inserted during intercourse, and this is where semen and sperm are delivered during ejaculation in the case of an intercourse. The cervix is the head, the top of the vagina, or really the base of the uterus, and it is partially open during the menstrual cycle, allowing fluids to flow both in or out. In the case of menstrual bleeding, fluids flow from the uterus out through the vagina. It closes during pregnancy to maintain a closed environment inside the uterus during pregnancy. So this slide now illustrates the highlighted structures here illustrate the names of the anatomical structures that you do need to know to understand female reproductive anatomy. This slide shows a schematic image of female reproductive anatomy. It shows the ovaries, two of them, ovaries, connected to the rest of the body by some ligaments that you don't need to know the names of. The uterus, with its inner lining of endometrium and its muscular layer of myometrium, smooth muscle, very important for childbirth, for labor and delivery. The base of the uterus is the cervix, as I've said before, connected to the vagina. The fallopian tubes at the end have structures called fimbria. So when a oocyte is ovulated from a ovary, we're going to get to that in a few minutes, it is picked up by the fimbria and then propelled by cilia that line the fallopian tube. Cilia move in a wave-like fashion and move the ovulated oocyte picked up by the fimbria into the fallopian tube and move it from the ovary through the fallopian tube to the uterus. If the oocyte is fertilized, it will implant in the uterine endometrium and a pregnancy will result. If the oocyte is not fertilized, it will not implant, a pregnancy will not result, endocrine changes that are associated with pregnancy don't happen, and I'll go into great detail about those in a few minutes, and the uterine endometrium would not be sustained, and that will result in a degeneration of the uterine endometrium and uterine menstrual flow. So that would be the end of a menstrual cycle in the case of no pregnancy. Now let's talk about the process of oogenesis, the development of oocytes, or ova, eggs. Oogonia are the precursor, primordial cells of the that develop into oocytes. Oogonia develop in the fetus. So when the woman who is developing eggs, when the woman was herself a fetus in the uterus of her mother, that's when her oogonia develop and develop into primary oocytes in the ovary of the fetus. But then they undergo meiotic arrest and nothing happens with them until that woman reaches puberty. And at puberty, the endocrine changes associated with puberty, increasing estrogens, increasing progesterone, starting of the menstrual cycle, the cycling of endocrine changes, estrogen, progesterone, and gonadotropins, that those cycles cause puberty. And at puberty, oocytes will start to develop from primary oocytes into secondary oocytes. The transition from primary oocytes to secondary oocytes happens when there is the first step of meiosis. So primary oocytes undergo meiosis 1 to develop into secondary oocytes. Now, so one primary oocyte develops into one secondary oocyte. The other cell that develops during meiosis 1 is called a polar body. So meiosis produces two cells, just like you learned about in CGI, but only one of them is an oocyte. The other one is a polar body. The secondary oocyte will mature and be ovulated. If there is fertilization, then the second stage of meiosis, meiosis 2, happens. It only happens after fertilization by a sperm. If it is not fertilized, it does not happen, and the oocyte, the secondary oocyte, would be ejected during menstrual flow. If there is meiosis 2, it develops a mature ovum, an egg, a fertilized egg, and another polar body. So one primary oocyte develops one mature ovum after fertilization, typically. Of course, there are cases where two are ovulated, in which case, and if they both become fertilized, that would be fraternal twins or dizygotic twins. And sometimes the secondary oocyte will split into two oocytes, and if both of them become fertilized, that would be identical twins or monozygotic twins. And in the case of triplets, there are sometimes three primary oocytes that are ovulated and become fertilized. That is rare. Typically, it's just one. And so typically one ovum develops and is fertilized from one primary oogonia, from one primary oocyte, which came from the oogonia. Just a word on pronunciation. This is oogenesis, not oogenesis. These are oocytes, not oocytes. Having talked about some of the anatomy, let's talk about the phases of the female reproductive cycle, the menstrual cycle. The menstrual cycle is divided into two phases, the follicular phase and the luteal phase. And the separation between them is when there is ovulation of a mature oocyte. So before ovulation is the follicular phase of the menstrual cycle, and after ovulation is the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle. So at the beginning of the female reproductive cycle, at the beginning of the menstrual cycle, the beginning of the follicular phase, multiple follicles, each of which contains a primordial oocyte, multiple follicles develop during the early follicular phase. That is happening simultaneous with the bleeding of the uterine endometrium from the previous menstrual cycle. So during the first few days of the menstrual cycle, when there is uterine bleeding from the previous cycle, multiple follicles are developing in the ovary. One follicle is going to become dominant. Typically one, sometimes two, sometimes three, but typically one follicle becomes dominant, and the non-dominant follicles will undergo atresia or degeneration, a form of apoptosis. So one follicle, at the middle of the follicular phase, one follicle becomes dominant and continues to develop into a mature follicle containing a mature oocyte, and the rest of the follicles containing immature follicles, immature oocytes, undergo apoptosis, atresia, and degeneration. At the transition from follicular phase to luteal phase is ovulation. Ovulation is a complicated endocrine event that I will unpack in the next few slides in the next few minutes. At ovulation, a structure called the corpus luteum exists and develops. During the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle, the corpus luteum is going to produce hormones that will continue to sustain the development of the uterine endometrial lining, which has become quite blood-filled in order for there to be a surface in which a fertilized oocyte would implant and become, would obtain nutrients. If there is no fertilization and there is no implantation of a fertilized oocyte, the corpus luteum does not receive a signal to sustain itself, and it degenerates. The degeneration of the corpus luteum leads to degeneration of the endometrial lining of the uterus that leads to uterine bleeding at the end of the luteal phase and at the beginning of the next menstrual cycle. In order to understand the menstrual cycle, in order to understand ovulation, we need to understand the endocrine changes, the hormonal changes during the menstrual cycle. So this is a complicated image from your textbook that shows the endocrine changes and the physical changes in the ovary during the female menstrual cycle. This image from your textbook has a series of numbers that walk through this sort of step by step. So I think your textbook does an excellent job of describing this complicated series of physical and endocrine events. So use the textbook as a supplement to this part of the lecture. We're going to start with the physical changes and then go to the endocrine changes. This image is a blow-up of the ovary. So we're looking at a schematic drawing of the ovary, and it shows the physical development of follicles, each of which contains an oocyte during the menstrual cycle. Let's talk about some of the strictly anatomical terms here. There are ligaments that hold the ovary in place, but you don't need to know the name of them. The middle layer of the ovary is called the medulla, and the outer layer of the ovary is called the cortex. The surface of the ovary is called the tunica albuginea, just like the surface of the testis in the male. In the cortex of the ovary are hundreds of primordial follicles. They are throughout the cortex of the ovary. Now, there's something misleading about the slide that happens right now. This slide makes it look like the primordial follicles develop into primary follicles and then develop into secondary follicles and then develop into mature follicles. And it makes it look like these follicles are migrating around the ovary. That's not what happens. That doesn't happen. It is using the different location. This image is using the different locations as a stand-in for different periods of time. So I just want to be clear here that if one of these primary follicles becomes the one that becomes dominant, it's going to develop right here. It's all of the next stages are going to happen here. It's not going to migrate around the ovary. Okay, that doesn't, migration around the ovary doesn't happen. But in order to show the different stages at different periods of time, this slide makes it look like there is movement. So now let's go through the stages in time, remembering that as I move around in space, I'm not really moving around in space, I'm moving through time. Primary follicles, primordial follicles will develop. One of them becomes dominant and develops into a primary follicle. So primary follicles develop and one of them becomes dominant. And the dominant one will continue to develop into a secondary follicle, and the rest of them undergo atresia. The follicle has a mature oocyte in the middle, surrounded by the zona, surrounded by a thin layer called the zona pellucida. So the zona pellucida surrounds the oocyte. Zona pellucida surrounds the oocyte, and on the outside of the zona pellucida is a layer of cells called granulosa cells. The granulosa cells surround the oocyte that is covered by a layer called the zona pellucida. On the outside of the granulosa cells is going to be a third layer of cells called the theca. The theca cells are on the outside. So this slide, this part right here shows a oocyte inside a follicle. The follicle is the oocyte, zona pellucida, granulosa, and theca. Those are the layers. It continues to develop and becomes a secondary follicle. Again, the oocyte in the middle, surrounded by the zona pellucida, surrounded by granulosa cells, which are in turn surrounded by theca cells. This secondary follicle develops into a mature follicle. This image uses the words vesicular or graphian. You can use any of those terms. It is a mature, this is a mature follicle. So we have a mature oocyte surrounded by a mature zona pellucida, zona pellucida surrounding the oocyte. Surrounding that are granulosa cells. Granulosa cells surround the oocyte, and they also surround a fluid-filled compartment that has developed called the antrum. The antrum of the follicle is a fluid-filled compartment surrounded by granulosa cells. On the outside of the granulosa cells of the mature follicle are the theca cells. This is the mature follicle, and this is what ovulates. So it is a mature oocyte inside a mature follicle that is ovulated during the process of ovulation. Surrounding the oocyte is still the zona pellucida and a set of the granulosa cells that now becomes a structure called the corona radiata. The cells that remain inside the ovary, the remaining granulosa cells and theca cells, will develop into a structure called the corpus luteum. And here is this is an image of a mature corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is what's going to be very important during the luteal phase after ovulation. Again, this corpus luteum is not over here if the oocyte that is developed is over here. All of this is taking place in one location. Let's look at a cartoon that shows the development of the ovarian follicle during the follicular phase of the menstrual cycle. A primordial follicle containing a primordial oocyte surrounded by a layer of granulosa cells develops into a primary follicle. One of the follicles becomes dominant and continues to develop. And so that's the story we're telling now of a primary follicle that has become dominant and continues to develop. The others undergo atresia and degenerate. The oocyte becomes fully developed. It is surrounded by a layer called the zona pellucida. The zona pellucida surrounds the oocyte, and surrounding that is a layer of granulosa cells. Granulosa surrounding the oocyte. And surrounding the granulosa are going to be theca cells. So theca on the outside, then granulosa, then zona pellucida, then oocyte. This structure continues to develop. So the secondary or pre-antral follicle becomes a early antral follicle. It's still secondary. And then that is going to become the mature ovarian follicle. During this development, the oocyte is mature. The zona pellucida is stable and mature. The granulosa cells proliferate. The granulosa cells proliferate. They continue to surround the oocyte, but they develop into this structure that surrounds a fluid-filled antrum. The antrum of the follicle is a fluid-filled compartment rich in estrogen. Surrounding the granulosa cells are again, proliferating layer of cells, of theca cells. And so this structure here is the mature ovarian follicle that is going to lead to the ovulation of the oocyte. The next few slides are real histological sections through ovaries showing that the cartoons that I've been showing you of the developing follicles represent what really happens. So this is an image of an ovary. Here's the tunica albuginea on this outside. Here are the primordial follicles, a cluster of primordial follicles in the cortex of the ovary. Over here on the right, more primordial follicles, and one follicle, one of them, developing into a primary follicle. So one of them is becoming primary. The oocyte is developing. The granulosa cells are proliferating. There is a zona pellucida between the oocyte and the granulosa cells. The development continues. So this is continuing the development of the ovarian follicle. Here is a mature follicle showing the fluid-filled antrum, the oocyte surrounded by the zona pellucida, itself surrounded by a layer of granulosa cells, and outside that, a layer of theca. So let me erase this so you can see that the cells are actually there. Oocyte, granulosa, theca. This is a zoom in of the oocyte. This on the right here is a zoom in of the oocyte, granulosa, theca. So the cartoons are, and the antrum, the fluid-filled antrum. So the cartoons are a reasonably good representation of the way things actually look in histological cross-section. This is an image of an ovulation. So here is the tunica albuginea of the ovary. The ovulating oocyte bursts out of the ovary, surrounded by the corona radiata, a layer of granulosa cells that goes along with the oocyte during ovulation. Here are the fimbria of the fallopian tube that are getting ready to attach themselves to the oocyte, and then cilia of the uterine tube will propel the oocyte from its binding site on the fimbria into the fallopian tube, and then cilia will propel that oocyte through the fallopian tube to the uterus. The space between the ovulating oocyte, the space between this ovulating oocyte and the fimbria has probably been exaggerated in this image. What I learned is that the fimbria are actually wrapping around the oocyte, the ovary. And so it's easy to imagine that this oocyte gets directly transitioned to these fimbria. Now, let's turn our attention from the physical changes in the ovary to the endocrine changes. Now we're going to look at this complicated pattern of increases and decreases in the levels of hormones during the menstrual cycle. Here at the top are the levels of LH, luteinizing hormone, and FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, the levels of hormones, the gonadotropins released by the gonadotrophs of the anterior pituitary as a function of time, going from the beginning of the menstrual cycle to ovulation to the end of the menstrual cycle. And in this case, no pregnancy, no fertilization, no pregnancy happens. At the bottom are the levels of other hormones, estrogen and progesterone, steroid hormones, during the during the menstrual cycle. Again, as a function of time. So this is all aligned as a function of time. So let's walk through this. At the beginning, there is relatively low LH and FSH. It's there. It is being produced by the gonadotrophs of the anterior pituitary in response to a amount of GnRH from the hypothalamus. So LH and FSH levels are there, but they are low and they are stable. They are relatively stable during the first few days, first week or so of the menstrual cycle. Estrogen is low and progesterone is very low. Then about midway through the follicular phase, the levels of estrogen start to increase. Why is that? It's because the estrogen production is by the granulosa cells, and the granulosa cells have proliferated. So there's more of them. So more cells are producing more estrogen, and the levels of estrogen increase. The levels of LH and FSH are still low and stable. The level of progesterone is very low. So it is the level of estrogen that is increasing during the second half of the follicular phase. It gets to a point, there is a point where the estrogen level is high, and a high level of estrogen combined with a low level of progesterone causes a change and triggers a transition from negative feedback control of LH and RH to positive feedback. So a transition from negative feedback to positive feedback causes a surge in LH and FSH levels. A transition from negative feedback at low levels of estrogen to positive feedback at high levels of estrogen causes a positive feedback, a surge in LH especially, and FSH to a lesser extent. This surge in LH, this spike of LH and FSH, is what is going to trigger ovulation at the dotted line. So this line indicates ovulation, and it is triggered by this LH-FSH surge, which was in turn triggered by high levels of estrogen caused by the release of estrogen from a high development of granulosa cells. After ovulation, levels of estrogen fall, and the corpus luteum that remains in the ovary after ovulation develops and produces progesterone. The development of progesterone, the increasing levels of progesterone and the decreasing levels of estrogen return to negative feedback on LH and FSH. So the surge of LH and FSH terminates, and the levels of LH and FSH return to low and stable-ish levels. So it is progesterone produced by the corpus luteum, high levels of progesterone, low intermediate levels of estrogen, return the system back to negative feedback, low and stable levels of LH and FSH. If there is no fertilization, and in this case, no implantation of a fertilized egg into the uterine endometrium, the corpus luteum does not receive a signal to sustain itself. So if the corpus luteum then degenerates, the level of progesterone falls, the level of estrogen falls, the uterine endometrium does not receive a signal to sustain itself, and so the uterine endometrium degenerates, and that is what is menstrual bleeding. It's the blood from the highly vascularized, well-developed uterine endometrium that is lost. The endometrial cells and the blood flows, and that is menstrual flow. And then the cycle would start over again. Let's walk through these endocrine changes in a schematic version, a schematic form that articulates the feed forward and feedback control. So let's start with at the early and middle of the follicular phase. The hypothalamus is secreting GnRH into the portal circulation. GnRH receptors expressed on the gonadotrophs of the anterior pituitary cause them to secrete FSH and LH. LH, luteinizing hormone, traveling through the blood everywhere, but theca cells in the developing follicle, in the developed follicle, theca cells respond to activation of LH receptors by LH, and they produce androgens like testosterone and androstenedione. This is analogous to what happens in the male, where LH triggers the Leydig cells to produce androgens like testosterone. At the same time, FSH from the gonadotrophs, receptors in the granulosa cells respond to FSH receptor activation by proliferating. So the granulosa cells proliferate in response to FSH, and the theca cells proliferate and produce androgens in response to LH. But now something interesting happens. The androgens produced by the theca cells are converted by the granulosa into estrogens. And so estrogens are produced by the granulosa, converting the androgens that were produced by the theca. Estrogen builds up because the granulosa cells are proliferating. The antrum of the follicle becomes a rich bath of estrogen, and the estrogen exerts positive feedback on the granulosa. So part of the proliferation of the granulosa, was due to FSH, positive feed forward, and part of it was due to estrogen in a positive feedback proliferation cycle. The granulosa proliferate, the theca proliferate, the theca make a lot of androgens, the proliferating granulosa convert those androgens to estrogens and continues the development. The estrogen continues to exert positive influences on the oocyte development. The estrogen gets into the bloodstream. Of course, estrogen gets into the bloodstream, and at these low levels of estrogen, the estrogen causes negative feedback to maintain homeostasis, or a relatively stable level of GnRH, FSH, and LH. The thing that's changing here is the proliferation of the granulosa cells and that causes increasing levels of estrogen. There is also a hormone called inhibin, which maintains negative feedback as well, but I'm not going to dwell on that. The point is, during the early and middle follicular phase, estrogen levels are low but increasing, but they are low, and that maintains negative feedback and stable LH and FSH production. At a certain point, when the granulosa becomes well enough matured and the number of cells becomes high enough, estrogen levels become high. They get high, and at a certain high level of estrogen concentration, there is a dramatic transition from negative feedback control to positive feedback on the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. So when the estrogen levels are high, that makes for a positive feedback. So it causes the anterior pituitary to secrete more LH, which causes more LH, which causes more ovarian development, which causes more estrogen. More estrogen, more. So this is a positive feedback loop. It also includes a long loop to GnRH. So there is positive feedback looping, and that positive feedback, more LH, more FSH, causes that surge or spike in LH and FSH concentration. A positive feedback, LH, FSH, ovarian development, high estrogen, positive feedback. When there is that surge in LH especially, but FSH as well, that's what triggers ovulation. The FSH LH surge triggers ovulation. After ovulation, the cells that remain in the ovary, the corpus luteum, now exists. The corpus luteum now exists. It develops and it produces large amounts of progesterone. That's what it does. The cells of the corpus luteum produce progesterone. The granulosa cells convert into producing estrogen into producing progesterone. When there is high levels of progesterone and high levels of estrogen, that combination of high progesterone and high estrogen return the system to negative feedback. And so now there is the LH-FSH surge is terminated, and the LH-FSH levels return to low and stable levels because of negative feedback. So the LH and FSH continue to exert an influence on the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum still is controlled by the low levels of LH and FSH, and it continues to develop. But the combination of progesterone and estrogen lead to low and stable homeostasis levels of GnRH, LH, and FSH. This slide really summarizes what I've been teaching for the past few minutes. So in the early follicular phase, GnRH released by hypothalamic neurons in the median eminence causes the anterior pituitary cells to release LH and FSH. LH stimulates the theca to produce androgens. FSH stimulates the granulosa to convert those androgens into estrogens. Estrogen levels are low, but increasing because the granulosa and the theca are proliferating, but these low levels of estrogen exert negative feedback. When the follicle is fully developed, LH exerts an influence to making the well-developed theca to make a lot of androgens. FSH tells the well-developed granulosa to convert those androgens to estrogens. Now we have a high level of estrogen. High levels of estrogen exert positive feedback. more LH, FSH, more development, more estrogen, more LH, FSH, da 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 da. Positive feedback, a surge in LH and FSH. That surge triggers ovulation, and after ovulation, the corpus luteum produces progesterone, and the combination of high progesterone returns the system to negative feedback. And now we have LH sustaining the corpus luteum, but it's at a low level. The surge has terminated. Now, you may be wondering, how can we convert from negative feedback to positive feedback? And the answer is that there are different receptors. High affinity receptors detect the low blood levels and cause negative feedback. Low affinity estrogen receptors that are activated by the high concentrations of estrogen trigger the positive feedback. And then the high levels of progesterone interacting with progesterone receptors triggers the return to negative feedback. So some of this phenomenology of the LH-FSH surge has to do with different receptors with different affinities. Let's continue and talk about the hormones specifically. So estrogens, including estradiol, but other estrogens as well, are steroid hormones that are released by the granulosa cells of the ovarian follicle and the cells of the corpus luteum after ovulation. The stimulus for estrogen production is LH and FSH. Well, LH is what stimulates the production of androgens by the theca, and FSH stimulates the proliferation of the granulosa cells. But combined together, those hormones from the anterior pituitary is what stimulates the ovarian follicle to make estrogen. Estrogen, like the other steroid hormones, interacts with intracellular receptors. There are many effects of the estrogen. Some of them that we've been focusing on are on the maturation of the oocyte and the development of the follicle. But of course, estrogens have interactions throughout the body and the nervous system that lead to female physical characteristics, maternal behaviors, and other stereotyped female behaviors. Just to be clear, female behavior also includes high intelligence, bravery, courage. I don't want to make you think that I think that female behavior is only maternal. I want to emphasize that there are many forms of female behavior that are not shown on the previous slide, including high intelligence, motivation, courage, etc. Progesterone, the hormone that is produced by the corpus luteum, is also a steroid. As I said, produced by the corpus luteum. Its stimulus is mostly LH from the anterior pituitary after the corpus luteum forms. It is important for maintaining the uterine endometrium, and in the case of a pregnancy, developing the mammary gland. Intracellular receptors, like the other steroid hormones, and I've said, maintaining uterine endometrium, growth of mammary tissues during pregnancy. Here is a structure of progesterone. Here is a structure of estradiol, one of the estrogens. You do not have to be able to discriminate them from one from another or from the androgens, but again, I want you to be able to recognize this four-ring structure that is characteristic of all of the steroid hormones. Now let's summarize with a slide that encapsulates many of the changes we've been talking about. So this is a slide that looks at time across the x-axis from the beginning of the follicular phase to ovulation to the end of the follicular phase of one cycle that did not result in a pregnancy, and then a second follicular phase, and a second luteal phase in a situation that does result in a pregnancy. So this is 2 menstrual cycles, one not pregnancy and one that results in pregnancy. So, and here are levels of progesterone and estrogen during those 2 cycles. This part here is cartooning the endometrial layer during the menstrual cycle and the deterioration, the decay of the uterine endometrium during uterine bleeding, during menstrual bleeding in a menstrual cycle that was not that in which there was no pregnancy. Here are images of the developing follicle and the developing corpus luteum during a menstrual cycle with no pregnancy, and then the degeneration of the corpus luteum after that when there is no fertilization and no pregnancy. And here are the levels of FSH and LH during a menstrual cycle. So let's walk through these. This is just reminding us that LH and FSH are from the anterior pituitary. So let's walk through this just a little bit. Beginning of a follicular phase. Decreasing levels of estrogen, low and stable levels of progesterone. The uterine endometrium starts to develop and become, thicker. The follicle develops, and because of the proliferation of the granulosa cells and the theca cells, the levels of estrogen start to increase. All of this is under stable and negative feedback control of LH and FSH. When the estrogen levels become high enough, that converts from negative feedback on LH and FSH to positive feedback and causes the surge in LH and FSH, which in turn triggers ovulation. Throughout this period, the endometrium is developing and proliferating. At ovulation, the corpus luteum produces progesterone. Progesterone levels increase. Increasing progesterone triggers the end of the LH surge and the end of the FSH surge because of a return to negative feedback and a return to low and relatively stable levels of LH and FSH. The uterine endometrium is now fully developed, ready to receive a fertilized oocyte. But if that doesn't happen, there is no signal from the uterine endometrium to maintain the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum then degenerates and the uterine endometrium degenerates and there is menstrual flow. If, on the other hand, there is fertilization of the oocyte that we will talk about in the next lecture, the fertilized oocyte, which really becomes an embryo, implants in the uterus, in the uterine endometrium. That implantation causes the release of another hormone called chorionic gonadotropin. Chorionic gonadotropin, the hormone released from the uterine endometrium after fertilization, sustains the corpus luteum and sustains high levels of production of estrogen and progesterone, which maintains negative feedback on LH and FSH, preventing any more LH and FSH spikes. That doesn't happen because of this sustained negative feedback from progesterone onto LH and FSH, onto the anterior pituitary and onto the hypothalamus, maintaining low production of LH and FSH. And now we have an implanted embryo, embryogenesis, development of the embryo and then the fetus, and pregnancy, which is going to be the topic of the next class. Let's end with a couple of clickers. Which of these is a correct match? Is progesterone well matched with the corpus luteum? Is gonadotrophs matched with LH and FSH? Granulosa matched with androgens? Theca matched with estrogens? Give you a few seconds to answer this in your mind or on a piece of paper. The answer is A and B are good matches. The corpus luteum is the source of progesterone. The gonadotrophs are the source of LH and FSH, but it is the theca that produces androgens, and it is the granulosa that produces estrogens, so these are not good matches. Which of the following is a correct match? Is the early follicular phase matched with negative feedback on GnRH, FSH, and LH? Is the late follicular phase matched with positive feedback on those hormones? Is the LH and FSH surged matched with positive feedback? Is the luteal phase matched with negative feedback? I'll give you a few seconds to decide which of those are correct. They all are correct. In the early follicular phase, there is negative feedback, maintaining a low homeostatic level of GnRH, FSH, and LH. In the late follicular phase, the high estrogen levels triggers positive feedback. And that positive feedback is what triggers the LH and FSH surge. So those are all good matches. Not necessarily in the same direction, but they are matched. During the luteal phase, the high levels of progesterone return the system back to negative feedback and a low and stable level of LH, FSH, and GnRH. So this is the last slide. Raise your questions, please, on the forum on Moodle. And next week, we will move from this story to the story of the physical and endocrine changes associated with pregnancy. So pregnancy, childbirth, and then the production of milk by the mammary glands after childbirth in the process known as lactation. I'll talk to you next week.